of Socialist Action, a steering committee member of the NDP Socialist Caucus. We acknowledge that this gathering takes place on the Indigenous lands, including the unceded territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resources corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's webcast is titled Corporate Media and Manufacturing Consent. I am your host, and I am joined by Eve Engler in Montreal, Jonathan Goldsby in Toronto, and Emily Stairs in Guelph, Ontario. Eve Engler is a political activist who grew up playing hockey, as it were, on left wing. He is the author of 10 books on Canadian foreign policy, which 2 of these include Left-Right Marching to the Best of Imperial Canada and A Propaganda System, How Government, Corporations, Media, and Academia Sell War and Exploitation. And of course, his latest book is House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy. Jonathan Goldsby is the news editor at Canadaland, which is a Canadian news site, podcast, and podcast network that was created in 2013. By the fall of 2018, it featured podcasts on media, art and culture, cooking, medicine, and politics. And Jonathan also co-hosts Canadaland's Wag the Dog podcast. Yes, you guessed it, is about the Premier of Ontario and the consequences of his government actions. Emily Stairs is a leading member of Socialist Action who resides in Guelph. She is a grad student in music at Wilfrid Laurier University, where she helped to organize a union for teaching assistants, now represented by the Public Service Alliance of Canada. So Eve will speak for about 20 minutes, and then Jonathan and Emily will speak for about 10 minutes each, after which we will then go to questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the webcast directly from YouTube and by typing the question directly to the chat column. We welcome your questions. Our presenters will do their best to answer them. If you like this webcast, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. If you agree with what you hear tonight, please join Socialist Action by signing up on our website, www.socialistaction.ca. or by calling 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. So let's begin. Welcome once again to our show. Eve, congratulations for the part you and your partner Bianca played in preventing Ottawa from gaining a seat on the UN Security Council. And I'm wondering how difficult it is for a left-wing critic to be seen and heard on mainstream media. So take it away, Eve.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to this. So basically, to answer that shortly, it's very difficult for a left-wing critic of Canadian foreign policy to receive any sort of platform of significance, be that on the CBC, in the Toronto Star, etc. And I'm going to start by saying the dominant media in this country is biased in favor of power, in favor of the businesses that don't want the minimum wage to be increased, in favor of continued colonization, in favor of white supremacy, etc., etc. So the media is definitely structurally biased in favor of power. But I would argue that when it comes to Canadian foreign policy, it's at a whole other scale of refusal to allow genuinely critical voices to be heard. And I personally have experienced that. In the early 2000s, as I was getting politicized, focusing on a number of different domestic issues, I was able to get op-eds published in the Montreal Gazette, in the Ottawa Citizen, in the Globe and Mail. I'm not sure exactly how many, but about a half dozen, And my experience is that I didn't necessarily get an op-ed into the paper when I submitted it, but my ratio of getting it in was maybe a third, or 1 in 3 times I would get something published in a major daily. With regards to writing about Canadian foreign policy, critical stuff about Canadian foreign policy, my experience over the past 15, 20 years, as I moved towards focusing more on Canadian foreign policy, is almost nothing. I've submitted dozens and dozens and dozens of op-eds. I believe I've had 4 published over the 15 to 20 years I've been writing about this stuff. And now I know what people are saying. They might be saying, "Hey, this guy's a bad writer." It's not a question of bias, but it's a question of the individual. In 2012, I went and worked for the Communications Energy Paperworkers Union. And one of the things I did when I was in the research department of the CEP was I wrote op-eds for the president of the union under the name of the president of the union. And in a pretty short period of time, I had a dozen op-eds published by mainstream corporate dailies. The vast majority that were submitted actually, got published. Now, of course, this was coming with the institutional heft of the union. So it's not just an individual, but it's, a whole institution behind it. All those op-eds that I got published, I should say, were all about domestic issues. Some of them pushing the bounds, some of them even calling for economic democracy, calling for why do we have, electoral democracy, but we don't have democracy in the economic sphere. So some of them were fairly radical. And what I took from this, or what it confirmed to me, is that there is an incredible bias on foreign policy. The narrowness of debate that is acceptable in a dominant media in this country on foreign policy is quite narrow. Now, before getting into some examples of this, general examples, just to say that I think there are a number of structural elements to understanding the bias in the dominant media in this country. One of them is the ownership structure. Of course, it's a few companies that own almost all of Canadian newspapers and Canadian media in general at this point. And the views of the owners tend to trickle down. That mostly happens at a sort of general level, and you can't sort of prove it per se, but there are some examples where they've been written about, clear examples of owners intervening on foreign policy coverage. There's, of course, the famous example or infamous example of the Izzy Asper, when they bought the I guess it was Can West papers at that time, and they brought in the harsh anti-Palestinian position, pushed editorials from the central office in Winnipeg that led to a editor at the Montreal Gazette, or a publisher at the Montreal Gazette, quitting. Forced the papers to use the term terrorist instead of rebel to describe Palestinian resistance. There's another example that's been written about the Desmarais family with regards to China. The Desmarais family is very invested in China, and when the Harper government was viewed as picking fights with China, they criticized the Harper position, and they got their paper La Presse and other Quebec papers to take up their perspective on the question of Canada-China relations. There's some other historical examples I cite in the book, A Propaganda System. Another important structural element of the bias in the dominant media is their dependence on advertising, which mostly comes from major corporations. One element of that with regards to foreign policy is from half century, the largest, or one of the largest arms manufacturers in this country was General Motors, which was also the largest advertiser in Canadian media. And there's a long history of General Motors using their advertising dollars to influence media coverage. Beyond ownership and corporate advertising, there's the question of the sourcing of media. What institutions have the capacity to generate news coverage. There are far more people that work in public relations today than there are journalists. So it's something like 4-to-1 public relations people versus journalists, which means that there's people trying to generate news coverage, and many more people trying to generate news coverage than there are people reporting on news coverage. Probably the starkest example of that is the Canadian military. The Canadian military is the biggest public relations entity in this country, and they have something like 660 people working in public relations. And a large part of what they're trying to do is get pro-military stories into newspapers, onto TV, into radio, etc. And that's also, I think, when we talk about the manufacture and consent in media, it's a mistake to just look at it, sort of narrowly with the media. You got to also broaden the propaganda structure more generally. So, for instance, on Canadian foreign policy, one of the sources of stories for the media, one of the institutional, I guess maybe you could call it like reliances that media has, is on the different think tanks and academic institutions. So, for instance, the Munk School of Global Affairs, the most important school of global affairs at a university in this country, at the University of Toronto, that, of course, was set up by the founder of Barrett Gold, Peter Munk. Barrett Gold and Peter Munk himself was on record repeatedly having a very clear outlook on what policy should be about, and specifically, he wanted a Canadian foreign policy that advanced the interests of Canadian mining companies. More generally, he was somebody who was a very right-wing individual. So the media, when they search out for voices to speak about different issues, when there's a major international affairs institute in the media capital of the country, in downtown Toronto, the $50 million or so that Peter Munk put into building up that School of Global Affairs, that, of course, shapes the media. And in fact, if you look more closely, the Globe and Mail, for instance, has very close ties to the Munk School of Global Affairs, but also to the Munk debates, and they actually have a formal relationship with the Munk debates. So you see that the sourcing of media outlets is biased in favor of power, because the military, for instance, has like I said, 600 plus people working in public relations, paid employees in public relations, whereas the peace movement might have one or two, and so that, of course, offers many more opportunities to put forward pro-military information. Another structural element to understanding the bias in the dominant media is flack, is the pushback, and what organizations have the capacity to push back when there are stories that are not to their liking. The best known example of that would, of course, be Honest Reporting Canada, which is a pro-Israel or anti-Palestinian flack organization that's infamous for its campaigns against different media outlets and pressuring them to only run a anti-Palestinian kind of disposition. Also, the military and different military-associated institutions have a whole long history of running these very effective flack campaigns of putting pressure on media outlets when they run stories that go counter to the militarist perspective. And I think also an important part of understanding the bias in the dominant media, I mean, there are many other facets to it, but another important kind of element is the question of nationalism. It's incredible how much nationalism there is regarding foreign policy, particularly. There's nationalism in general, but I think some of that is starting to break down with regards to colonization and the dispossession of First Nations. There's now a sort of recognition that being pro-Canada with regards to it, certainly with regards to Indigenous people, is something that's not acceptable in kind of liberal circles. But when you look at Canadian foreign policy, very much, in my opinion, foreign policy nationalism is the sort of last bastion of even on progressives' ability to get outside of. And you see that with the United Nations Security Council campaign, or the No to Canada on United Nations Security Council campaign. It was quite remarkable how many individuals were unable, people who were critical of all kinds of elements of Canadian foreign policy, were totally unable to say that Canada didn't deserve a seat on the United Nations Security Council, even though by any even superficial look at the comparison of the Canadian versus Irish versus Norwegian foreign policies, those are two countries that Canada was competing with for 2 seats on the Western Europe seats on the Security Council. The Irish and Norwegian policies on a host of issues that most progressives would be supportive of. The Canadian position was way worse than Ireland and Norway's, and yet there was an unwillingness to oppose Canada's bid for a seat on the Security Council, and you saw that with the reaction after Canada lost its bid for a seat on the Security Council. It was remarkable. There was a group of us, 8 of us or so, that did this really intense campaign for more than 6 weeks, and we, without a doubt, had an effect on the vote at the UN, we affected it so much that the Canadian ambassador, after a 5-year campaign for the Security Council seat, in the days just before the vote, he was actually forced to write a letter to all the other UN ambassadors, basically responding to our letter campaign that generated 1,300 individuals to email every single UN ambassador to complain about Canada's position, its anti-Palestinian positions at the UN, and then we had some other campaigns that dealt with other issues. But the Palestine one was the most successful. And the Canadian ambassador actually wrote a letter responding to us. So there was so much chatter about what we were doing with the UN ambassadors in New York that he was forced to write this really pathetic response to us. So there's no doubt that we had an impact on the vote of the Security Council. Yet after Canada loses, there's almost no media that is interested in hearing our perspective. We put out a press release within minutes, literally of minutes, of the Canada failing, losing the vote. We had been, campaigning aggressively, and the dominant media basically ignored, or I should say ignored, but they with the proportion of the coverage that came to those who were critical of Canada's bid for Security Council seat. Of all the coverage, I would say maybe it was 0.5% of all the airplay of all the stories, etc., came to those critical, and that's just a one recent example of the bias in the dominant media. Most of the people they turned to for coverage of why Canada lost were government officials or former Canadian diplomats, which is quite a unique situation where you get people who have an obvious direct a link to the vote, being the ones that get to comment. Now, in my book, A Propaganda System, I delve into a number of really extreme biases, examples of biases in the dominant media on Canadian foreign policy. I'll just run through a few of them real quickly. One is a book called Le Patron de Dallaire Parle, so the boss of Dallaire speaks. That's Romeo Dallaire. He was the head of the military component of the UN mission in Rwanda in 1993-94, and the head of the overall political UN mission was Jacques Roger-Boubou, who was the former foreign affairs minister of Cameroon, longtime Cameroonian diplomat. He wrote an entire book detailing his disagreement with what Romeo Dallaire did and showing how Romeo Dallaire supported one side in this civil war going on in Rwanda. And that book of Romeo Dallaire's, I did a Canadian newsstand search for its coverage in the Canadian media a few years ago when I did my book, and there was one National Post review headline: "Allegations called ridiculous, UN boss attacks general." There was an Ottawa Citizen piece headline: "There are many sides to the Rwandan saga," and then there was a letter by an associate of Dallaire criticizing the book. So there was basically no coverage of that book in the dominant Canadian media. Now, Romeo Dallaire's book, Shake Hands with the Devil, according to the Canadian newsstand search I did, there were 1,700 articles mentioning that book, and something like Dallaire more generally in the Canadian newsstand search. So just basically, just again, this is the Delair's boss in Rwanda, who was a former Cameroonian foreign affairs minister, writing a whole book documenting Delair's one-sided approach to the conflict in Rwanda. Just a total, it didn't exist in the dominant Canadian media. Another example of extreme bias in the dominant media in this country is after the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. Canada militarized its response, sent 2,000 plus troops alongside about 12,000 US troops, didn't send the heavy urban search and rescue teams based in Canadian cities across the country, which are designed to get people out from rubble, provide basic health services, provide some basic needs after something like an earthquake. Canada didn't send its heavy urban search and rescue teams, but sent 2,000 troops. Now, as somebody involved in Haiti solidarity activism at the time, we argued that that was because they were trying to control the country. It flowed from their general approach to Haiti of overthrowing the government 6 years earlier, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that was proven about a year later, about a year after the earthquake. The Canadian press, through an access to information request, ran a story based upon access to information request, internal Canadian government document that said that they sent troops because of the post-earthquake power vacuum, quote, because of concerns about political fragility. This is quoting the Canadian government document. Political fragility has increased the risk of a popular uprising and has fed the rumor that ex-President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, currently in exile in South Africa, wants to organize a return to power. And they said, they again repeated that they were concerned about to contain the risks of a popular uprising. So after this horrible earthquake, this absolute horror that took place, tens and tens of thousands of people dead, Canada's response was, how can we control the situation through our military? Again, this was the Canadian press that wrote this story. I'm getting this from the Canadian press. That Canadian press story, according to Canadian Newsstand Search, the only newspaper in the country that ran that story was the Kamloops Daily News. Every other editor in the country that usually has access to Canadian Newsstand didn't still see fit publishing that story. A couple places, I believe, put it on their website. Another example of bias. This is maybe not what people would consider the dominant Canadian media. This is some personal examples. Now I'm moving into is Huffington Post. I used to blog regularly for Huffington Post. There were many examples of them constraining what I wrote for political reasons, what I took as political reasons. One really kind of funny example was with a story about that I did just after Trudeau won in 2015 about the responsibility to protect doctrine, which is a liberal imperialist doctrine that justifies the powerful countries intervening in weaker countries' affairs. The story I wrote talked about the use of the responsibility to protect and justifying Canada's coup in Haiti in 2004. And the editor at Huffington Post wanted proof that Canada had cited the responsibility to protect doctrine to justify the coup. I provided that proof via two different stories, one based on access to information request, written by Anthony Fenton. And the editor of Huffington Post responded by saying, quote, "We need mainstream sources to verify the facts in your blog. And unfortunately, the facts below are only in the publication cited or printed elsewhere by the same authors." So I responded to the Huffington Post by saying, quote, "Huffington Post cannot publish something if it has not been in the corporate media. This seems like a fairly major flaw admission, and I'm very curious to know if it is official policy." They, of course, did not respond to that. Now I'm being told I need to wrap up, but I just want to give one final example, just to run through this really quickly, which is a story with regards to the National Observer. National Observer is a pretty good on environmental issues. I submitted a story to the National Observer back in November about people firebombing the Canadian embassy in Port-au-Prince. There's actually photos of it. It took place. The managing editor, Laurie Few, agreed to publish the story and actually asked for some updates and some photos based upon a demonstration we just organized here in Montreal. Then the editor-in-chief, then the story doesn't appear, and a few days later I said, "What's going on? When you're running it?" The editor-in-chief, Linda Solomon Wood, responds by saying, basically they don't cover Canadian imperialism in Haiti. And she says, quote, there are many topics we simply don't get into because we don't know the issue well enough. Before I would want to publish opinion on Haiti, I would want to have an in-depth reported feature or investigation from on the ground in Haiti. Well, I immediately Google searched National Observer in Haiti, and I found that they, in fact, had run 6 different stories mentioning Haiti that year, over the past year. Now, so I sent that to her, and I said, you know, that's not true. You've run stuff on Haiti. And she responded, yeah, but they're all from the Canadian press. So I responded by saying, I'm guessing that many of your left-wing readers would understand the political implications of National Observer being able to publish stuff on Haiti that comes from the Canadian press, but not activists, authors on the issue. Wood didn't understand what I was getting at and said, so what are your implications? I responded, quote, that you can put out the official perspective on foreign policy, but not critical perspective, which is my sense of your coverage of Venezuela and now Haiti. Effectively, you become a pro-imperialist media outlet. So my point here is that, yes, the dominant media, the National Post, the Toronto Sun, the Toronto Star, the CBC, their coverage on Canadian foreign policy is incredibly biased in favor of the government's perspective, in favor of the corporate perspective. But uniquely so, foreign policy, the bias and the limited range of debate, you see it trickle down all the way into more left-wing places like the National Observer. I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Sorry for going too long.
Okay, thank you, Eve. So now we're going to move westward along the 401, leave Montreal, and come back to Toronto. So welcome, Jonathan. And I will put the question to you. Is it true that freedom of the press exists mainly for those who own it? So go for it, Jonathan.
Sure. So, I mean, you raised the point that, you know, in Canada, the dominant media is biased in favor of power, which maybe, I guess, made me immediately think and wonder, is there a country anywhere in which that isn't the case, in which the dominant media isn't biased in favor of power? I mean, there probably are a handful of examples here or there, though none come to mind. But I think it's almost inherent in the idea of dominant media. When you think of what gets to be dominant media, what exists that is dominant media, how has it gotten to that point, and why do we consider it the dominant media at all? That, I mean, there is pretty clearly, always has been and continues to be, a direct correlation between capital and influence in the public discourse via the media. That's a long-standing issue that has only recently started to be upset somewhat by the internet, with many positive results and some negative ones as well. And I think it's worth remembering that mainstream media, I mean, is the mainstream media by virtue of some confluence of power and wealth, whether it's sometime in the distant past, whether it's the Globe and Mail being founded almost 200 years ago, or whether it's something in the more recent past, like, I don't know, the founders of Vice, being able to sort of trick a series of billionaires into investing in them over the past 15, 20 years. That's not really surprising, and it's part of it, and that's one of those things that's really, it's a contradiction that is necessary. It's almost baked, that's pretty much baked into media, that there is this idea among many journalists that the point is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, to fight, to act as a critical check on power, while at the same time, in order to do that with the largest reach and sometimes most effectively, you require the resources of that power system itself. I mean, the power, it's this endless loop and reinforcing itself and all those paradoxes there. But it is fairly straightforward in Canada. If you look at, for example, the largest newspapers, the Globe and Mail is owned by the Thompson family. It's held by a private holding company. The Toronto Star, that for a long time had been controlled as a public company, has been a public company, but controlled by 5 particular families, families of the publisher and the other senior people there in the 50s. But later this month is expected to be sold to a couple rich Toronto guys and their families with no real relevant experience. They just were able to get together the money. Post Media, the largest newspaper publisher in the country by far, with the control of the only dailies in many Canadian cities and the only English language daily in Montreal. I mean, the majority of its shares are owned by like a secretive hedge fund in this called Chatham Asset Management, and a billionaire who lists his official address as a country club in Florida. But I think that really gets into things that although both of those people, both Chatham and its owner and the billionaire Leon Cooperman, are both right-wing and have very firm ideologies, there's also no particular reason to believe that either of them has any real interest in the content of the papers. And that's where it gets really fascinating and almost really sad, because as Canada reported last summer, there is and has been and continues to be a move within Post Media to concentrate and centralize its political coverage across the chain nationally. So National Post has always been its flagship paper for as long as Post Media has existed, which is about a decade. That's always been a right-wing newspaper. But the other dailies it's had across the country have had a variety of political stances, usually more appropriate to the politics of a given city. So, for example, yes, the Calgary Herald has kind of always been a conservative paper, but the Edmonton Journal, up until just a few years ago, was a reasonably center-left paper, or at least a more progressive paper than you would imagine a Post Media paper in Alberta being. And so there's been a move to extend the sort of the voice and ideas of the National Post, fighting whether it's questioning the reality of climate change, or pushing ideas of culture wars, or just backing Jason Kenney. There's been an active move to have all the newspapers across the chain spread that message. But what I find really insidious, or perhaps maybe just even more disturbing, is that it's arguably less than an extension of values, because that's what the owners believe, than it is simply a business strategy. And in my own opinion, I think that's actually worse. Like, it's one thing if you're the Aspers and you want to just like blast your message everywhere. I think people kind of understand that that's how media often works and often has worked, and that owners will exercise that power directly. But there's something more insidious about there actually being no real necessary values at the top, other than that they see right-wingers as a more lucrative audience. And then, if they, looking at things like Jordan Peterson or other people, they see that there is a market there. People can raise money pretty easily. People can sell their books pretty easily. It doesn't take a lot to. What they believe, and not incorrectly, is there's a large untapped market in giving people what they want to hear, and that to me is actually almost more unsettling. But I mean, it does also extend to their values beyond that. I mean, labor relations, they've been recently in a bit of a pitched battle, or were in a pitched battle with the two major unions that only represent a third of their members. That's still quite a lot of people across the country. Even getting to a point where they were making efforts to turn Toronto Sun employees against their own union. I never ended up really getting around to reporting that, and it had I wouldn't say a happy ending, but I'd say that resolved itself. But it's, power has certainly been fascinating. Now, the fundamental challenge is, what would it take, given how entrenched power is, given that mainstream media is mainstream media in large part because of its relationship to the existing centers of power, what would it take to enact or enable or at least spark a fundamental challenge or a fundamental change, a fundamental shift in the discourse, of the larger discourse, in a meaningful way? And I would argue that Twitter has been a surprisingly effective tool in that regard, where it has birthed social movements, and it's had an ongoing effect on discourse, in large part because Twitter is disproportionately occupied by people in the media and by politicians. And as a way to give voice, and as a way to sort of give voice to some sort of larger consciousness that is previously not expressed in the same way, that previously didn't have a single outlet, it's been remarkably effective. So we just passed the 10th anniversary of the G20 summit in Toronto. And I think it's really, for a lot of people, it's really hard to remember how long it took to change the way those events were seen by the general public. Twitter didn't have nearly the same penetration it did in 2010 as it does now. Not that it even has a major penetration now, but in 2010, people who watched the events of that weekend on CP24 remember a handful of police cars set on fire, some smashed windows, and were more than happy to have police crack down on what they would see as anarchists or the Black Bloc or whatever. Whereas people who followed along on Twitter or walked out and saw it themselves recognized that by and large that weekend was a police riot. It was the police on several distinct occasions basically going apeshit and beating people, arresting people, kettling people for no or little discernible reason, and abusing all kinds of rights in a scale of atrocity that really hasn't been grappled with. And it took about 6 months for that understanding to really shift from in the mainstream, largely thanks to the ongoing campaigning of the Toronto Star, not just the Star, but they kind of led that. And it was quite a while before people stopped thinking, before most people stopped thinking of the G20 as, you know, that weekend where the police cracked down on rioters, and more where that weekend where the police went on their own riot against peaceful protesters. And now you think about 10 years later, I've never seen an idea go from being considered radical and unacceptable in the mainstream discourse to being part of the mainstream discourse as quickly as that of defunding police. It literally, within the course of a week, it went from something that was considered so radical you couldn't bring it up on the CBC, to being something that even multiple National Post columnists were arguing in favor of. And now it's something that is talked about everywhere, every day. That is hopeful to me. I mean, there are good and there are bad things about the fact that more people than ever believe that the mainstream media doesn't represent them. But the positive thing there is that people are, thanks to, in large part, to online platforms and just a better, more and more sophisticated understanding of how media and power work, are able to advance these alternatives and shift the conversation very quickly. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. So let's leave Toronto now and head for Guelph. So welcome again, Emily. And I will ask you, what do socialists say about how the working class can break the stranglehold of the corporate media on news and public discussion? So maybe you can bring that into your presentation. Go for it.
Sure. I'll start with that right away, just because it kind of ties into what Jonathan was talking about just there with the advent of social media. I'm a big fan of the concept of surveillance, which is, people turning, our own tools of communication and our own tools of media against the state and contradicting state narrative, which I think is incredibly powerful. And we're seeing that, as Jonathan was saying, on Twitter, showcasing the scope and brutality of police actions in G20 and also currently in the United States with the Black Lives Matter protests. And I think as socialists, I think we have a duty to take the reins on that and, put out agitation and put out contradictory narratives, which we at Socialist Action do with our newspaper and our media presence insofar as we can. So thank you for watching. I wanted to speak a little bit about the concept of propaganda, which has been a huge thing for me to learn since joining Socialist Action in 2017. Yes. When I first encountered people using the term propaganda in kind of common parlance, I was very much taken aback. I was like, propaganda is this, evil, terrible thing that, Joseph Goebbels did with the Nazi Party. And it took a while for me to understand that propaganda is any form of media can be understood to be propaganda, because propaganda is something that aspires to convince you of a certain political perspective or presents a certain political perspective, then expects you to agree with it. And when I had that understanding, I became a lot more comfortable with, hey, would you mind helping us spread around the propaganda? But that really struck me, and ever since, that has caused me to really reanalyze how I interact with any form of media: social media, television, YouTube shows, and of course, mass media here in Canada. What is the political perspective that they espouse that they are assuming that their audience also agrees with? And how can we be critical of that? You can take any number of examples for that. Lots of conversations happening right now about the TV show Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is a propaganda show set in New York that many, many people really love because it's a very lighthearted sitcom, but it is also very, very pro-police. And there are a lot of people waking up to that fact that, wait, this is a piece of media that exists to convince me, the viewer, of a particular perspective, which is that, cops are mostly good except for a few weirdos. And I am, as Jonathan said, there is a really rapid cultural shift happening with regard to public perception of police. And I'm very, very curious to see what that trajectory is and whether it lasts or whether or not there will be a reactionary pushback in the next couple of months, as we've seen in most social justice causes ever. I also want to occupy my space as your token Gen Z and talk about this idea of social media and memes and social media as a tool of suppression and oppression versus a tool of liberation. I think, we've talked about how social media is a public voice and is a site for public discourse that is so, so, so valuable and so important. Like, there's so much footage of protests going on right now, and so much information and so much voice being given to these issues that would otherwise never get covered or would be actively suppressed. However, it is important to remember that Facebook and Twitter and Twitch, YouTube, all of these sites, all of these social media sites that everyone has access to and can post to, also have significant amounts of restriction on them. Like, they are multinational media corporations, and they have a duty to support a particular view. We've seen this in the aftermath of FOSTA SESTA in the United States, which was an anti-sex work piece of legislation that has comprehensively destroyed a lot of people's abilities to exist on platforms and actively suppresses women's voices speaking out on sexual liberation. There's also the question of algorithmic manipulation. We've encountered the aftermath of Cambridge Analytica and the aftermath of the US election, and it is no secret that memes are a powerful, powerful political tool for radicalization. And I know we on the left use memes constantly as a tool for radicalization, but it swings both ways. And memes and social media are becoming an increasingly popular way for people to discuss ideas. And algorithmically, people are pushed and siloed into particular political factions internet where the social media sites know that people will stay. They will retain those views and make loads and loads of money advertising because they have a particular set of eyeballs. And so there's this kind of attention economy being generated through social media that, first of all, mines our data and sells it to advertisers, and has been demonstrated to be incredibly unsecure and has led to people's persecution and deplatforming on every side, as well as how this is a tool for radicalization and the espousement and proliferation of increasingly hostile, politically siloed viewpoints. So yes, as I say, I think it is incredibly essential that we remember to view social media platforms as both a site of public discourse, but also multinational corporations that have a vested interest in people staying on the platform and also saying the right things and promoting the right kind of content, whatever they choose to mean. I mean, you know, Mark Zuckerberg has a particular viewpoint that he and his companies aim to promote. I'll conclude by saying the three major questions to ask yourself when analyzing any piece of propaganda or any piece of media. The first thing you always ask is who benefits from this story? What perspective is being lauded here? What is the ultimate goal? What is the benefit of this piece of media? And am I a beneficiary? Is my community? Or is it something else? And then along with that, what political position is this media trying to convince me of, or what political position do they take? And finally, what is not being said? I mean, I know, Eve, you mentioned the coverage of Venezuela, and we in Socialist Action hosted a demonstration in early 2018. I believe it was 2018 or 2019. I'm sorry, someone correct me. Where we marched at CBC and said, you are covering one perspective, you are talking to one kind of voice, you are not including a diversity of perspectives, and the perspectives you are including directly align with the stated Canadian foreign policy. So that is no coincidence. And so when you have to ask yourself who is not being represented and what is not being said.
Okay.
That's all for me.
Okay, thank you, Emily. So now I know we have questions for sure. So the format now from the questions from our audience will be, if our panelists got pens and paper ready, our producer will give them 3 questions, and you can answer 1, 2, or 3 if you wish, but you each have up to 5 minutes only, because we got quite a few questions and we want to get in as many as we can. So each will have 5 minutes, and we will start with Emily, then Eve, and then Jonathan. So Kurt, could you give us the questions, please?
All right, so the first question is from Daniel Terade, and he asks, how do we as socialists challenge the pro-military PR firms? The second question is from myself, and the question is, how can independent media achieve the same level of reach as the corporate media without succumbing to the same influences that corrupt corporate media? And our third question for this round is, the defeat of Trudeau's bid for Security Council seat was a victory for people of Palestine, Venezuela, and Haiti. How did you and Bianca break through mainstream barriers to wage a great campaign?
Okay, Emily? Whichever question you want to tackle.
So I will answer the first question, which was, how do we challenge pro-military PR firms as socialists? And I think it is eminently possible. There was a woman whose name I completely forget. If someone knows, you can remind me, but she has been an active campaigner and a peace campaigner and anti-war campaigner, and through freedom of information requests was able to get multiple documents about the cost and implementation and testing of the F-35 fighter jets, and what the true cost versus what the stated cost was going to be to the Canadian taxpayer base, and how those were going to be utilized and the costs of maintenance on top of all of that. And she successfully, like through her research and through her access to freedom of information requests and sending that to public media and hosting protests, like even one-woman protests outside of offices in Toronto, sparked enough conversation and interest, and instigated letter writing campaigns and phone banking campaigns that caused the F-35 jet issue to come into kind of a national prominence. And there was such a blowback against, well, hey, this was the stated cost and this is what the actual cost is going to be that you knew and you chose to neglect. We do have a certain freedom to push back. We need to have dedicated campaigns for that purpose. And I think there's an important level of involving everyone who is affected. So one of the things that's really effective about the anti-F-35 campaign is the fact that she managed to incorporate ecological perspectives. So like the eco-socialist perspective. She got the churches involved, especially churches that have a dedicated pacifist mission. Feminist groups became involved. And so there was a lot of solidarity for this one issue in particular. And I think we need to have a focus on particular issues and showcase how this is of detriment, because, as Eve said, there's a really, really strong barrier to be faced when it comes to talking about foreign policy and how Canadian intervention affects everywhere else, and getting it into the national discourse of how it affects all of us, not just internationally, but here domestically, is a really, really essential component of that.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, Eve?
Eve, you're muted.
Sorry, taking off from where Emily left off, I think that one thing we have to, first thing we have to recognize just the scope of the military's PR apparatus. I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars a year. They have a huge history department. They have people who work on PR. They have, offices, dozens and dozens of offices across the country, PR offices. They're very elaborate in how they treat journalists in different kinds of wars. So for the air wars, like the bombing of Libya, they basically excluded journalists. Afghanistan, they took the total opposite. They brought them as close as possible through embedding program. So this is well thought through on the military's part. So first of all, we have to recognize that. Now, the military is kind of interesting. While they're the biggest public relations entity in the country, the population generally has sympathetic attitudes towards the military, but have considered the military spending almost always ranks among the bottom of people's priorities, right? So if you get the people prefer, focusing on healthcare, on education, or more concerned about the environment, or more concerned about the economy, or whatever, the military. So when you get into discussions of where we should put public resources, the military is actually on quite a weak footing, despite spending such incredible amounts of money to try to scare us into believing we need more military, or just the military is great, etc. So that leaves some openings. Now what the openings are, I mean, from an activist, I mean, what you do is you do everything from you hand out leaflets denouncing militarism to you occupy offices, to you disrupt politicians and say no spending on F-35s, national daycare. I mean, the methods that we have, we live in a relatively free society. The methods that we have to counter that power are many. It's about getting organized. It's about doing the work, etc., etc. And the media, and I think this is a really important point. I've now had this experience in a number of areas. The media, the bias in the dominant media in this country in favor of the government's perspective on foreign policy, in particular on issues where the ruling class is in alignment, not like China is an issue where the ruling class is not in alignment. There's big divisions within the ruling class on how to deal with China, and so the media is pretty open. But on issues like, say, Haiti, where the ruling class is totally in alignment, the bias is incredible. It's extreme. But I've also seen, particularly in Haiti solidarity activism here in Montreal, all kinds of ways in which we've been able to break down that bias and actually have quite a bit of effect through the dominant media in getting out critical perspective. I don't have the time to go into all of that, but through a combination of tenacious activism and well thought through planning, that is doable. And I think that the No Canada on UN Security Council seat reflects that to some extent. That campaign, which really got going on May 19th, when we had an op-ed published in the Toronto Star arguing against Canada's Security Council bid. In fact, that was postponed because of the pandemic for 2 months. Long story, but that campaign was an example where, with the dominant media, in particular the more liberal Toronto Star, we got a lot of prominent people to back that op-ed, to back that criticism of Canada's Security Council bid, and we used the sort of horse race. The media was focused on the horse race of will Canada win the Security Council, will it not. They weren't really focused on the substance. They don't. So we used the horse race to insert some critical discussion in there, and it was a relatively small number of people, no one being paid. We worked really hard for 6+ weeks. Well, there's a whole phase of work that happened months ago that was also an incredible amount of work. There's all kinds of advantages that we had. We had, Bianca, my partner, she organized the LEAP manifesto, and so she had contacts with all kinds of prominent people that helped to get those people to sign on. So we use this sort of celebrity culture in some way to get in these critical perspective, and there's problems with that. But yeah, so we were able to break through from the standpoint of critical discussion of Canadian foreign policy. We were able to break through in kind of a unique way. It still was a very small proportion of the discussion around the Security Council, but it's a mixture of tenaciousness, hard work, and being creative in what to do. And again, the media is incredibly biased, but we aren't living in a totally totalitarian state. There are openings there, and it's important for us to push on those openings where they're available.
Thank you, Eve. Jonathan?
So the other question, the third question, is a really, really fascinating one. It's certainly one that I think about all the time. I guess the media largely being my beat. The question is, how can independent media achieve the same level of reach as corporate media without succumbing to the same influences? And there are a few answers to that, and none of them these are the ones that have come to my mind in the last 10 minutes are particularly encouraging. One, it's hard to imagine any media actually gaining the same level, any new media gaining the same level of reach as corporate media these days. No matter, what are the most successful independent-ish media outlets of the past few decades? BuzzFeed, Vice, Vox. They don't and can't get to the same level as CNN. They won't and will never be the New York Times. They'll never be, nothing in Canada will ever be the Globe and Mail or the CBC. So on the one hand, I don't know if it's possible for anything started at this point in history to actually reach that same level of influence, or even the same level of resources, even just to do good things, let alone all the compromises that have to be made. Secondly, it's a larger problem, a larger question that is involved. That comes up anytime you're trying to dismantle a system or construct an alternative, which is to say, how do you go about creating something new without even inadvertently just reproducing the same structural issues? And that is an ongoing problem in so many spheres where you think you're doing better or you want to be doing better, or maybe you are doing a bit better, but still, same, deep down, many of those same fundamental problems or biases still exist. I worked for Now Magazine for 4 years. I think the one time I ever had an article of mine killed was when I was writing something about Israel and Palestine. I got it in pretty late, but still, there are still limitations. There are still these limitations. But I guess in a more hopeful, how can media build itself up in a way to not have the same influences? One way is to diversify sources of revenue. That will not for sure fix things, but for a long time, for 75 years or more, most media subsisted, got most of their revenue from advertising. Because if you wanted to place a classified ad, if you wanted to advertise any product, basically your options were television or newspapers or radio. And with the advent of the internet and many other options, and basically the death of paid classified advertising, media has had to start looking for new or trying to diversify sources of revenue. Canadaland, where I work, is a mix of advertising on the podcasts and crowdfunding, which is not exactly the same as subscriptions, but basically Patreon, where you actually have a supporter base of people who voluntarily choose to contribute on a monthly basis. And we are responsible to them, but there are enough of them that it's sufficiently diversified, in theory anyway, that there isn't really any one controlling interest there. And so that's certainly something that all kinds of new media are looking at, it, new and diversified sources of revenue, so that you're not necessarily reliant on any one center of power, or in the case of crowdfunding, where you can distribute that power broadly enough and thinly enough so that although you're responsible to them, there's no one voice or influence. But it's a good question, and I would certainly love more suggestions and ideas about what would a genuinely new and alternative media look like.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. So we're going to go back to our producer now for 3 more questions. And remember, the time is 5 minutes each, a strict 5 minutes each. And we will start this time with Jonathan, Emily, and Eve. So, Kurt, questions?
All right. We are practicing a strict one question per person first, and then we'll go back to those questions. So Barry Weisletter had posted a question, but he has already been answered one question, so his question will be brought down lower on the list. We'll get back to that question. So right now we're with John Wunderlich, who asks, I would be interested in Eve's view on Meng Wanzhou's extradition and the two Michaels coverage in the media. Ellen Ramsey asks, with the growth in social media, is the readership of the mainstream press showing a decline? Is the readership of alternative media on the increase? And then Daniel Tered, who asked the question previously, but no other new questions have been asked, so no other new questionnaires are posing questions. So for Daniel Tered asks, how does the profit motive influence the lack of coverage given to the climate change? Is this driven by corporate funding or the news trying to not push viewers away by covering uncomfortable topics?
Okay, you each have up to 5 minutes to answer one or all. So we're going to start with Jonathan, Emily, and Eve. Jonathan?
So how does, it's good, they're all good questions, but how does the profit motive influence lack of coverage of climate change? That's an interesting one, because there are unusually direct examples of that we've seen. While some places have been getting incrementally better at covering it in Canadian media, and much better in some other places. To go back to the post-media situation, where, once again, specifically, maybe basically, as part of their business strategy, they put someone in charge of most political content across the chain, who is, a climate change denier. I mean, he probably characterized himself as a climate change skeptic. Certainly, he rejects, the scientific consensus on climate change. But I mean, because Postmedia as a chain basically decided that, or as the management there basically decided that the way they wanted to go as a business, because it was a more, I guess they saw it as a more profitable route, or a more potentially profitable route, would be sort of serving as, I guess, what they would see as this alternative voice for pro-oil sands people or climate change deniers who don't otherwise see themselves represented in media, and maybe they'll toss money toward having these views echoed back to them. So in that case, there's a fairly straight line between a profit motive, between a particular business strategy to try to claw themselves out of their debt hole, and how that they would cover climate change. Whether they would, when this happened, when these changes are made, there were reporters and columnists wondering, like, what does this mean for the future of even just writing about positively about carbon taxes? I mean, it has happened sometimes since, but and then if you look at something like the CBC, which is obviously slightly outside of, it has its own its own parallel set of dynamics, because it is a public broadcaster. It is not its responsibility to the public is slightly different. But similarly, because they are reliant on government money, and because they are responsible to the public at large, often in practice, what that ends up meaning is that they are most responsive to, they're responsive to, as he characterized, flack. Who gives flack? Who gives trouble? And something like covering climate change, and they really don't want to piss off Albertans. They really don't want to piss off the oil industry. And so for them, and the way they interpret their public mandate is sometimes in such a way as, well, we want to basically serve and acknowledge these views that are held by a portion of the public. And in practice, what that means is advancing the interests of oil companies, because they believe that that is what being responsible to the breadth of this country means. So even without an obvious, clear profit motive, although obviously the CBC is also a commercial entity and there's all that, there is still that dynamic where even trying to be responsible to the public in this broad way does mean that it greatly limits and restricts how climate change is covered. That's that's the answer to that. And I think, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Emily? You're on mute.
Oops, sorry. So I'll tackle two of those questions. The first is whether or not readership is in decline of mainstream media and there's an increase in alternative media. I definitely think so. And I think that's pretty demonstrable, what with the increase in paywalls on a lot of news media. They're quite desperate for funding because advertising is becoming a less lucrative method of funding large news media corporations, and there's also an avoidance or maybe an unpopularity in admitting or soliciting massive donations and funding from large corporations or billionaires, etc. Meanwhile, we've seen a massive increase in alternative media, like things like Vox and Vice and BuzzFeed and all of those, and social media-based sites. Massive increase in uptake, and I think that's good and that's healthy. But there's also the flip side of there's no vetting on a lot of these know for a fact that, things like Daily Stormer and Breitbart are gaining massive prominence. I mean, the editor of Breitbart was Trump's chief of staff, or what was his role? What was Steve Bannon's role? I don't know. It's been so long. There's so much change. But, massive, massive influence with no regard or integrity or checks, which I think increases the need for critical media study and media literacy. And I think this continues to be something that is essential in how we regard media of any source. Daniel's question of the profit motive versus lack of coverage of climate change, I think it's not only profit motive, but it's a question of ownership. When the National Geographic was bought out by Rupert Murdoch's media company a couple of years ago, it was understood that National Geographic will no longer be able to explicitly cover climate change related issues. They can only kind of sort of hint at it, but there's no explicit discussion of climate change and climate crisis. And I thought what they did was quite creative. Their last issue before they turned over the ownership was all about climate crisis. And every single issue and every single story in that particular edition was all focused on climate change, because they knew that under new ownership, they would never be able to run those stories again. And I think there's an important consideration of like who owns it. I mean, I used to live in New Brunswick, and there's massive, everyone knows that the Irvings really run the province, and the Irvings own most of the news media in New Brunswick. And of course, there's the Irvings are an oil family, and that's how they make their money. And of course, there's no coverage of climate crisis and no discussion of climate crisis in New Brunswick public discourse. There's very, very little. Even CBC hardly discusses any kind of climate change related coverage. So there's the profit motive, which is absolutely integral, as Jonathan discussed, but I think ownership is a substantial factor, if not the largest factor, in what is able to be covered.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Eve?
Yeah, I mean, I think with regards to the profit motive in climate coverage and some of that, there are many examples of oil companies, pipeline companies, automobile companies withdrawing advertising when they're unhappy with coverage. There was the one with the Vancouver Sun. It was, I believe it was the Enbridge pipeline, a comic and whatever they're called, a caricature, in the paper that was critical of the pipeline and threats to the publisher. That happened about 4 or 5 years ago. That got a certain amount of attention. General Motors, CBC used to have a program called General Motors Presents, and staff members internally called it General Motors Prevents, because General Motors interceded on what was being covered. I did co-authored a book called Stop Signs, Cars and Capitalism on the Road to Economic, Social, and Ecological Decay. And it's very well documented the role of automobile companies in shaping news coverage going back to the late 1910s, and very conscious effort by car dealerships to withhold their funding from the Chicago Tribune back then because they weren't happy with the coverage. And that there's examples that go up right until today. So that the concern around car company, oil company, the auto industrial complex, concern over their perspective on the climate crisis is very important to to newspapers. And you can cite examples of newspapers where, almost like half of the pages in the newspaper are car ads, right? The Toronto Star they had car sections that were up to like 32 pages. Just incredible. And half of that's like direct advertising by car companies, and the other half is just indirect advertising by car companies. So that's, I think, a very important point that has to always remember. Car companies have been for decades and decades, I'm not sure they still are, but for decades and decades, the biggest advertisers by a large margin. On the question of China, Canada, the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, I think that the China question is there's basically a division within the foreign policy establishment in this country on the question of China, and most of the business class wants better relations. It certainly doesn't want conflict with China. It's obviously a huge market. Concretely with regards to Huawei, some of the big Canadian telecommunications companies are using Huawei's products, and they're cheaper, and it would cost them a whole lot of money to replace those products. So a big chunk of the business class is quite strongly in favor of better relations. It's certainly no conflict with China. And then I think other segments of the business class basically just don't want conflict. They're not aggressive on the issue, but they're not particularly keen on a conflict with China. On the other hand, you have the military, the Five Eyes, the Communications Security Establishment, which is a arm of the Canadian under the Department of National Defense. It's part of the Five Eyes: Britain, New Zealand, Australia, the U.S., the NSA in the U.S., the intelligence agencies have been pushing for a conflict with China. They've been pushing before Meng was arrested. We're pushing for efforts to exclude Huawei from 5G networks in the US and other countries. And that's 4 or 5 months. I just wrote a story where I talk about some of this stuff. So you have this division within the ruling class. So the media's coverage of it is okay. I mean, I think that they are clearly on board with a sort of growing xenophobia, should I say, I guess. The American empire is turning hard against China, pivot towards Asia that goes back a decade, but that's just been ramping up. And obviously, Donald Trump is taking it to a whole other level in different ways. Canadian naval vessels maneuvers in the South China Sea alongside American vessels going back a number of years. Canada talked about setting up a military base in Singapore, partly due to contain China. So there's a whole campaign, and so the dominant media has allowed somewhat of a debate. The debate is oriented towards a pro conflict with China perspective, in large part because that's where the U.S. is. That's part because of the power of the military PR departments. There are elements of this that are completely left out. So for instance, Meng Wanzhou went to six different countries that have extradition treaties with the U.S. before, from the point where the American judicial system was seeking her out to when Canada detained her. 6 different countries. None of those countries, the Americans didn't ask them to detain her. And Mexico, she was en route from, via Vancouver Airport to Mexico, and Mexico officials told the Globe and Mail they would not have arrested her. Now that got reported in the Globe and Mail, so that's an example. Now some elements of this aren't being reported on the Globe and Mail. So the Canadian government talks about upholding the rule of law. Well, they're pursuing her for allegedly her company violating U.S. sanctions on Iran, which are, of course, contrary to international law. So we hear a whole lot about the rule of law, but in fact, Canada is defying international.
You're way over time. Please wrap up.
Yeah. So anyway, so it's the media coverage of it is there's two sides to it. And I think that because of the division within the ruling class, the foreign policy establishment, you have a certain degree of openness, but it's definitely oriented towards an unnecessarily conflictual relationship with China.
Thank you. Okay, so we are trying to keep this webcast, of course, within a 90-minute time limit, and we're starting to run out of time. And I know we still have more questions. So, Kurt, if you could put 3 more questions to the panelists, and they can choose which one they want to answer, because they have about 3 minutes each to answer. And the lineup will be Eve, Jonathan, and Emily. So 3 more questions, and no more than 3 minutes to whatever question you want to answer. Kurt.
Okay, so we actually only have 2 questions. Okay. So the first is from Barry Weisletter, who asks, who owns Canada's major mass media? Do you support nationalization of the giant corporate media and the establishment of democratic control of it by workers and communities? And the second question is by John Wunderlich. He says, I would like the speakers to address the fact that social media are actually for-profit websites and amplify the power of the right and ruling class more readily and more easily than the left.
Thank you, Kurt. So, Eve, 3 minutes.
Well, I certainly believe there needs to be a fundamental shift in the ownership structure of the media. I think that I've seen different proposals. It's not something I followed that closely, but I've seen different proposals about taking public money, allowing each individual to have like $50 or $100 a year to devote to media outlets of their choosing, a way of breaking down some of the financial obstacles to more one, to having media being dependent on advertising, and 2, to rich people just being able to have their own media and lose money on it. In terms of the social media, clearly the major social media corporations are these massive conglomerates. And so there are, I think, political biases that come with that. I do think that still the internet does provide some democratization of media in a way that is especially for international affairs, at least at the theoretical level. I mean, we can relatively few resources. There can be people, killed by Canadian trained and financed police in Haiti, today, and somebody can write a story and it can go around the world later that day. That's unique. That can be done with relatively limited resources, especially with both the internet and with the rise of video and cameras that people have on their phones. So there are some ways in which the social media can break down the power structure on these issues. But again, there's different ways in which those the biases can then reassert themselves.
Thank you, Eve. Jonathan?
Thank you, and I'm glad Emily has also has spoken extensively about this, because I didn't really get my introductory spiel. Didn't get to go into this, but yeah, no, the social media. Describing it as having a dark side is kind of an understatement. While it can be, as I mentioned, as we've discussed, very deeply powerful mass mobilization tools for social movements and for shifting the discourse in positive directions. Many of the platforms, in particular Facebook and YouTube, but not exclusively those, are arguably the most powerful platforms, most powerful tools for disinformation, propaganda, and radicalization that the world has ever seen. And there are, I mean, beyond just the corporate rules, I mean, there are structural reasons for that, right? I mean, to the extent that the right, that conservatism is the politics of fear, and I don't even mean that necessarily in a pejorative way. I mean, by and large, people who are more conservative respond to ideas of fear differently. I mean, Facebook, social media, YouTube, they play on that. They know how to press those buttons more effectively than anything else that has ever existed. And so, the right necessarily has advantages there. And so the good things that have happened in social media are maybe the progressive things that have happened anywhere are very much in spite of the platforms themselves, in spite of their ownership, in spite of the dominant instruction systems, probably more than they are because of them. It's about people trying to figure out, well, what are the tools we can use to actually change things? What are the elements of this thing that could actually be put to good use? And social media is very vulnerable to be taken over by and utilized by and weaponized by charlatans, grifters, demagogues of all stripes. But I am also heartened that as more and more people start to distrust mainstream media, and people unfortunately do fall for demagogues who are falling into this vacuum, many people are also becoming more sophisticated in their understandings of power generally, and do know how to critically receive and review and analyze media. And hopefully more people will find their way to platforms like Socialist Action.
Thank you, Jonathan. Emily?
Okay, I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I'll be super quick. So first of all, to Barry's question, I think, the question of who owns major mass media corporations, like this is a known entity. It is owned by wealthy billionaires. It is subsidized by multinational and wealthy corporations through advertising, and there's so little democratic control, even for public media conglomerates like CBC. There's so little public control, and I think there needs to be a shift, and I think news media should be a public entity. And I think along with that, there needs to be a reinvesting in a diversity of journalistic perspectives and an investment in journalism in general. Eve was saying earlier that, the ratio of, PR firms and PR workers to actual journalists is 4-to-1, which is just absurd, because we know, PR firms are going to be pushing a particular message, and we need to divest ourselves from news that comes from PR and news that comes from a particular corporation that actively espouses a singular viewpoint, and invest in journalistic diversity in whatever form we can. And social media is one of those. I spoke more extensively earlier on social media, and something that I didn't mention but I should have is this idea that, is social media a public forum, or is it a platform hosted by a private entity or private corporation? And this is something I've seen a lot of, internet figures discussing, is Facebook the town square? And, we spend so much time and so much of our lives on social media. Do we live there? And if we live there, should we have democratic say in how it is run? Should we be able to vote for who runs Facebook or who runs Twitter, who runs YouTube, instead of it being this CEO or this private media company? Because it is a place where people live, and where ideas are discussed, and where things are said, and where life happens. So why should we not be able to vote?
Okay. All right. So, folks, a special thanks to Eve, Jonathan, and Emily, and of course to our producer, Kurt Young in Mississauga, and to everybody who participated in tonight's conversation. So please consider buying a subscription to Socialist Action newspaper. It's only $25 a year and it's delivered to your door. To fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. So once again, folks, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next SA webcast is on Thursday, July the 9th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and is titled The History and Practice of Socialist Action and the Left in Canada, featuring Barry Weisleiter, Federal Secretary of SA Canada, and discussants Yvonne Hansen in Vancouver and Robbie Mahood from Montreal. And for details, just visit www.socialistaction.ca. So in the meantime and between time, please stay safe, healthy, and active. Bye for now.